The house smelled of sage and roasted turkey, the kind of warmth that should have promised comfort. I was moving down the hallway toward the guest room when I noticed the study door left slightly open. My father's voice carried through the crack, low but firm. "Your sister. She isn't worth a penny she's done." For a second, I thought I had misheard. Then Nathan's soft reply followed, uncertain, almost apologetic. I stood frozen, my pulse hammering in my ears. From my angle, I could just glimpse the curve of my mother's shoulder as she hovered by the window. Richard shuffled papers at his desk. Nathan sat slouched on the sofa, but it was Sylvia who turned her head first. Her eyes met mine across the narrow opening. Instead of shock or shame, she offered the smallest smile, as if she had been waiting for me to hear. The smile hollowed me out more than the words themselves. It told me everything I had feared but never wanted to believe, that my place in this family had been quietly revised, my value appraised and dismissed, all without my voice in the room. I stepped back into the shadows, every memory of overlooked trophies and deferred praise colliding into one sharp truth. The house felt colder despite the fire burning in the hearth, each portrait on the wall reminding me whose face had always mattered more. By the time I reached the guest room, my hands trembled so violently I could barely close the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bland floral comforter, the sounds of laughter from downstairs drifting upward, as if nothing had broken. But something had, and I knew I would not sleep that night. Sleep refused me, and instead my mind wandered backward through the years, tallying a ledger of childhood moments that now made terrible sense. Nathan was always the one under the lights. When he made the debate finals his junior year, my parents flew across the country without hesitation. That same week, I had qualified for the state math championship. I went alone with my teacher, my parents sending me off with a polite smile and a reminder that Nathan needed their support more. "You'll be fine," my mother always said, her tone gentle but dismissive, as if independence had been my natural state rather than a condition imposed by neglect. I learned early that recognition was a resource allocated sparingly and rarely to me. There was one exception, my grandmother Helen. She lived in a small craftsman bungalow across town, a house that smelled of lavender and old books. On weekends, she would spread bank statements across her kitchen table and walk me through the mysteries of compound interest and savings bonds. "Financial independence is freedom," she said more than once, her voice steady, her eyes sharper than anyone gave her credit for. While Nathan complained those visits were boring and often stayed home, I absorbed every word. When she passed away during my senior year, she left me $15,000. Specifically earmarked for education. At the reading of the will, I caught the quick glance my parents exchanged, something brittle in their expressions. Later, my mother remarked, almost casually, "Your grandmother always favored you," turning what had been a gift into a wedge. That inheritance became my ticket out, though even then it was reframed as imbalance. Nathan received tuition, housing, and endless allowances. I stretched Helen's gift across scholarships and part-time jobs, learning to live within margins so tight they cut. Lying awake in the guest room now, I realized Helen had done more than give me money. She had handed me tools my parents never intended me to have the knowledge to stand alone. As I pressed my palms against the quilt, I knew those lessons were about to become my only defense, because the account I had once called family had just declared me insolvent. Northwestern was the first place I felt both invisible and free at the same time. Invisible because no one there cared about the Albright family name. Free because for once I could define myself by numbers on a ledger rather than a role assigned at the dinner table. Helen's inheritance covered my first year's tuition and books. After that, I pieced it together: scholarships, work study in the library, tutoring calculus on weekends. I grew accustomed to counting every dollar twice, not out of fear, but out of pride. Back home, Nathan had chosen USC. My parents paid the bill in full, justifying the expense with words I could still hear. He needs the right environment to succeed. His right environment was an apartment near the beach and a new car in the driveway. Mine was a dorm with peeling paint, shifts at the dining hall, and textbooks bought used and resold for cash. After graduation, I moved east to Chicago, taking a position with a financial consulting firm. My apartment in Lincoln Park was barely 700 square feet, but it was mine. Each piece of furniture I bought secondhand and refinished felt like a declaration I build my life brick by brick. My emergency fund grew slowly, then steadily. Retirement contributions followed, and eventually a portfolio that outpaced even some of my older colleagues. But discipline did not erase obligation. Every month, without fail, I wired $500 back to Portland. It had begun years earlier, during what my father called a temporary slowdown in the construction business. I told myself it was my contribution, proof I still belonged to the family unit despite the distance. Even after the company recovered, the transfers continued, unquestioned. I thought of it as duty then, as though my independence had to be subsidized by a tether. Tonight, sitting in the guest room with my parents' voices still echoing through me, I saw it differently. The money I had sent all those years was more than obligation. It was fuel for a machine that now claimed I was worth nothing at all. Thanksgiving dinner was meant to be a celebration, but in my family, it always felt more like a stage. The table glowed with crystal glasses and silver polished to perfection, every detail curated by my mother. I had rehearsed how I would tell them how Michael had asked me to marry him, how the ring was exactly what I wanted, simple and chosen with care. I waited for the right moment. But before I could finish the sentence, Nathan cleared his throat and launched into a description of his latest startup idea. My father leaned forward immediately, eyes alight, peppering him with questions about market growth and venture capital. My mother placed her hand over Nathan's and smiled proudly, as though the meal itself had been prepared in honor of his vision. When I tried again, gently mentioning my engagement, the words fell flat. Sylvia glanced at me briefly, her lips curling into that faint smile I had come to know too well. It was the smile that told me she heard me, and also that she had already decided the subject was unworthy of attention. The conversation shifted back to Nathan, and my news vanished like a dropped fork beneath the table. Hours later, while the house settled into its late-night quiet, I walked past the study. The door stood ajar again. Richard's voice was firm, certain. The business, the house, the trust, all of it will go to Nathan. It's already structured. She doesn't need any of it. I held my breath, my heart hammering against the wall of my chest. Through the narrow opening, I saw Nathan nod, uneasy but silent. My mother stood at the window, her reflection caught in the glass. She turned, saw me there, and met my eyes without surprise. And then she smiled the same knowing smile that had silenced me at dinner before turning back as though my exclusion had always been part of the plan. I slipped back into the hallway, the echo of her smile burning hotter than my father's words, already knowing I could not let the night end without opening every ledger they had tried to keep hidden. The house was dark except for the dim light in the guest room where I sat with my laptop balanced on my knees. I should have been sleeping, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's smile, that quiet confirmation of my erasure. Instead of rest, I opened the folders I had carried across the country, the meticulous records I always kept bank transfers, account summaries, scanned receipts. At first, I told myself I was only reviewing them to distract my mind, but as the hours passed, the story of my life began to unfold in numbers that spoke louder than any holiday toast. Line after line showed the monthly transfers, $500 without fail, stretching back nearly 7 years. $42,000, wired faithfully to a family account I now knew had nothing to do with temporary slowdowns. I scrolled further and froze when I saw another entry, $8,000, pulled directly from the inheritance Helen had left me. The account had been drained 3 years earlier, disguised as a family investment. I traced it to Nathan's app launch, the one that fizzled before the ink was dry on his glossy business cards. No one had asked me. No one had repaid me. Then came the greater violation. I found loan documents linked to my father's construction company, the guarantor section bearing my name, my credit history, my stability, leveraged without my knowledge. I remembered signing a stack of insurance forms one Christmas visit, not realizing what had been slipped inside. The realization chilled me more than the November air seeping through the window. I began typing, page after page. I cataloged not just the money, but the moments the championship I attended alone, the scholarships I fought for, the dinners where Nathan's sketches or ideas eclipsed my every accomplishment. 7 pages in total, a record of a lifetime's imbalance. It wasn't for them. It was for me, proof that I hadn't imagined it, evidence that could withstand the denials I knew were coming. By the time the first light pressed against the blinds, my hands ached from typing, but my mind was clear. I had tallied the ledger, and the balance was final. The only task left was to place it before them. By the time dawn lifted over the hills, I had already brewed a full pot of coffee. The ritual steadied me, measured scoops, the hum of the machine, the sharp scent filling the quiet kitchen. I set 4 mugs on the dining table, one for each of us, and laid the folders beside them like place cards at a banquet no one had wanted. Richard was the first to appear, drawn by the smell. His eyes flicked from the mugs to my face, then to the neat stack of papers. He knew it was no ordinary breakfast. Without waiting for him to speak, I gestured to his seat. Sit down. There are things we need to discuss. Sylvia entered moments later, still immaculate in her morning clothes, a faint trace of perfume trailing her. Nathan stumbled in last, hair mussed, rubbing sleep from his eyes. They took their places, puzzled but wary. I slid a folder toward each of them. Inside is a complete record of every dollar I've contributed to this family since leaving for Chicago. $42,000 in transfers, $8,000 stolen from the inheritance Grandma Helen left me, and fraudulent loan documents signed in my name. Read them. Richard flipped a page, his jaw tightening. This is unnecessary, he said. Business is complicated. Families help one another. Help doesn't involve forgery. I answered. My voice was steady, calm, the tone I used in boardrooms. Sylvia reached for her mug, fingers trembling slightly. Corinne, darling, you're overreacting. We've always supported you in our way. Think of everything we've done, your education, your opportunities. My education was paid for with scholarships and jobs. My opportunities. I carved myself. What you've done is siphon my resources while telling me I didn't matter. Nathan sat silent, staring at the papers, lips parted but no words coming. I let the weight of the evidence press into the silence. Finally, I pushed my chair back and stood. I'm done. No more transfers. No more guarantees. I will not underwrite this family while being erased from it. The room seemed to contract, the polished table suddenly too small to contain us. Richard's eyes narrowed, Sylvia's face paled, Nathan's fingers tightened around the folder. I left the words there, final, already preparing for what would come next. Nathan was the first to break the silence, his voice rough with disbelief. Corinne, you've misunderstood. Dad never meant you weren't included. These things are complicated. You're making it sound worse than it is. I met his eyes across the table. Did I misunderstand working nights at the library while you were given a car at 16? Did I misunderstand paying my own way through Northwestern while Mom and Dad covered every dollar of your tuition at USC? Did I misunderstand sending $500 a month from my salary while you lived rent-free in an apartment they furnished for you? Color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed again. No words arriving quickly enough to blunt the truth. I leaned forward. The app launch you bragged about, the one that failed within months, do you know where part of the funding came from? His brows knit, uncertainty flickering. Dad said $8,000. I cut in. from Grandma Helen's inheritance. Money left to me for education. It went into your project without my knowledge, and without a single word of repayment. The paper in his hands trembled as he scanned the lines of my documentation. For the first time, he looked less like the favored son and more like someone who had been kept in a carefully curated illusion. He turned to our parents, his voice rising. "Is this true? You took her money to cover my business. You've been using her transfers all these years," Sylvia started to answer, smoothing her tone into reason. But Richard's sharp glance silenced her. The look only confirmed what Nathan already suspected. His shoulders sagged, confusion giving way to something closer to shame. For the first time, I saw the strings that had kept him elevated, and I watched him realize they had been pulled by the same hands that had tied me down. The room felt different then, as if the script had slipped from their control, and Nathan was left staring at the pages, unsure whether to keep reading or to finally set them aside. After the confrontation, the house seemed to close in on me, every polished surface reflecting back a version of myself I no longer recognized. I returned to the guest room and began to pack. The movements were efficient, practiced, like preparing for a business trip, though this time I knew I would not be coming back. On my laptop, I canceled every authorization connected to the family accounts. The automatic transfers stopped with a few clicks, and I sent notices to my bank that no future payments should be processed. Next came the harder work placing freezes on my credit reports, locking down the identity my father had used so freely. My firm's legal department responded within the hour to my encrypted message, confirming they would pursue the fraudulent guarantees tied to my name. With each step, the ties loosened, until all that remained were the shadows of them. My suitcase stood ready by the door before dawn. I had already changed my flight to Boston, where a new senior role waited. It was more than a promotion. It was a chance to start over in a city where no one knew me as Richard and Sylvia's daughter, where my work would stand without comparison. Before I left, I reached into my bag for the one item I had carried quietly all these years, the brass key to Helen's craftsman house. It no longer opened any lock, but it had always reminded me of safety. I stopped at a small shop near the airport and asked them to engrave a single word across its worn surface boundaries. When I boarded the plane, the key rested in my palm, warm from my grip. A final inheritance, not of money, but of meaning. As the wheels lifted from Portland's runway, I understood that my life was no longer collateral for anyone else's debts. Months passed before the first message arrived. Sylvia's email dripped with sentiment, weaving childhood memories into pleas for understanding. She reminded me of holidays past, of meals prepared and sacrifices supposedly made, though each line carried the unmistakable weight of guilt. I read it twice, then answered with 3 sentences acknowledgement of receipt, clarification that I was well, and a reminder that future correspondence should be limited to matters requiring documentation. Richard reached out soon after, though his tone was strictly professional. He introduced me as a trusted consultant in letters to his business partners, as though attaching my name might salvage the credibility he had lost. I redirected each inquiry to my firm's general line, ensuring he received nothing more than the same automated courtesy extended to any other client. The distance was firm, and I held it. Nathan's call came later. Hesitant at first, he didn't dress his words in excuses. Instead, he admitted what I had long suspected, that he had leaned on their support without asking where it came from, that he had accepted the advantages as natural. "I thought I needed them," he said quietly, "but I think I just didn't know how to stand without the scaffolding." His voice carried no demand, only recognition. For the first time, I believed he might learn to carry his own weight. In Boston, I built something Helen would have recognized. I established a scholarship in her name, dedicated to teaching young women in Oregon the very lessons she once laid across her kitchen table. Applications filled my inbox, students eager to understand budgeting, credit, independence. Each story reminded me that her legacy had never been the money. but the knowledge she gave freely. The past still pressed against me at times, but it no longer dictated my balance sheet. I was investing in futures that saw worth where mine once had been denied, and preparing for the day I would finally hang Helen's key on my own wall. My apartment in Boston overlooked the Charles River, the water shifting gold under the late afternoon sun. On the wall above my desk hung a simple frame, and inside it the brass key Helen once pressed into my palm. The engraving glinted faintly in the light boundaries. It had become more than a relic. It was a compass, a reminder that the locks I chose mattered more than the doors closed to me. When Michael and I married, the ceremony was small, held in a hall lined with windows that opened onto the harbor. Friends stood with us, colleagues who knew me not as someone's daughter but as someone whose work mattered. Nathan came alone, his suit ill-fitting, his expression subdued. He offered a quiet congratulations and no defense of the people who stayed away. That silence was its own kind of reckoning. The absence of Richard and Sylvia did not hollow the day. Instead, it confirmed what I had come to understand. Family is not defined by bloodlines or shared tables, but by those who invest in your worth without demanding repayment. My grandmother had known that truth long before I did. She planted it in me, and I carried it here, to this city, to this life I built without their scaffolding. In the evenings, I sometimes sit beneath the frame and let my eyes rest on the key. It no longer opens Helen's craftsman house, but it unlocks something far greater. It speaks of freedom earned, of dignity reclaimed, of love chosen rather than owed. And as I look out over the river, I know that the future waiting beyond my door is one I will open on my own terms.